Okay, well, it's 2:04, so I think in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm sure some of our other guests will be joining us shortly. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Christy Simon, President and CEO of the Central Maryland Chamber. Thanks for joining us this afternoon for our mid-session update with Ashley Duckman, Vice President of Government Affairs with the Maryland Chamber of Commerce. If you have any questions throughout the program, you can add them in the chat box or you can hold them until the end. We will have time for Q&A a little later in the program. And now I'd like to introduce Cindy Mitchell. She's a member of the Central Maryland Chamber's Board of Directors. She's also our Legislative Committee co-chair and the CEO of Blue Flare, who will introduce our speaker for today's program.
Thank you, Christy. Good afternoon, everyone. I have the wonderful pleasure of introducing Ashley Duckman, and who is the Vice President of Government Affairs at the Maryland Chamber of Commerce. As a VP, she leads advocacy efforts on behalf of the 4,500 plus members of the Maryland Chamber before the Maryland General Assembly and on the federal level. Duckman's responsibilities include developing, leading, and executing the legislative strategy of the organization and maintaining positive working relationships with key elected officials and members of the administration in order to build a better understanding and appreciation for business issues. Previous to joining the Maryland Chamber, Duckman served as Senior Director of Governmental Affairs and Public Policy of the American Gas Association. In this capacity, she assisted managing AGA's federal government relations goals and programs. This included advocacy and outreach on Capitol Hill on energy and environmental issues, including infrastructure, energy efficiency, and the role of natural gas in a lower carbon future. Previously, Duckman was responsible for AGA's state legislative and regulatory portfolio. This included outreach to state policymakers, including governors, attorneys general, state legislators, public utility commissioners across the country. Prior to AGA, Duckman served as legislative assistant for former National Republican Congressional Committee Deputy Chairman Dan Mattoon at Mattoon and Associates, where she assisted clients on issues ranging from telecom to education on projects and initiatives on Capitol Hill. Duckman has a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Economics from Washington College in Chestertown, Maryland. Welcome, Ashley, and thank you for being here today. And happy Women's Day.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm just thinking like, man, I got to get a shorter bio. It's like, Ashley likes long walks on the beach. That's true. But I appreciate you all having me this afternoon to chat. And with this size group, I thought, Christy, if you don't mind, rather than saving your questions to the end, feel free at any time to come off mute and ask and discuss, and let's have a conversation more than a presentation, because I think that's most helpful to me in hearing from you and what you're thinking about and feeling as it relates to some of these issues we're going to talk about. And hopefully it's more helpful to you to have a more dynamic conversation as well. But obviously, first and foremost, thank you, Christy, and the Central Maryland Chamber for your partnership and collaboration. Always, you have become a tremendous Federation partner. And through your work, we've been able to really maximize our grassroots abilities for business organizations in Maryland. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. So the way I always kind of start these, even though we're mid-session, I think the best thing to do, because the session is COVID, right? I mean, there are other things percolating, perennial issues that we've been working on for year after year after year. But by and large, everything that we're focused on this session as the statewide chamber has some sort of COVID element or COVID intersection. And so I always like to start with some just sort of foundational level setting about where we are with respect to the virus. And we don't have to get too deep. Everyone reads the news every day. Everyone's sick and tired of reading the news every day as a result of looking at metrics. But the good news is that our positivity rate is today at 3.36%, which is a really precipitous decline from where we were when session started and when I was first on the stump giving this presentation. All of our public health metrics are continuing to trend downward. This is a great sign for public health, obviously, but it is a great sign too for our economy and for economic recovery. The one sort of lingering concern that is out there, however, as we move through, vaccine phases, is that other states, fortunately, none of our adjacent states yet, but other states are starting to make drastic moves to remove restrictions and remove mask mandates. And it's happening in other states across the country. It'll be interesting to see how quickly it comes closer to us. I don't anticipate that it will in the very near term, but it'll be interesting to see how that impacts national metrics, sort of juxtaposed to the rate at which we are vaccinating and vaccinations are being deployed. Because obviously all of those metrics, all of that data is what informs how quickly our economy will be able to recover and what policy supports we need from the state legislature to move us through economic recovery more quickly. So as it relates to the state of the economy, sort of as an underpinning to where we are right now in session, the U.S. in our February jobs report actually added a decent number of jobs, 379,000 jobs last month, which was more than double what and this is national, these are national numbers. This is more than double what economic analysts expected. And the jobless rate dropped to its lowest point since last year at this time, March 2020, 6.2%, which is good. I mean, it's a great sign for our economy and our economic recovery. But even though the jobs report is showing signs of accelerated recovery, these gains really are just kind of a drop in the bucket compared to the damage that's built up in the labor market and in our economy over the last years. And really, it's deceptively low, the unemployment rate, which in my opinion, and in many economic analysts' opinion, ignores millions of Americans who are still out of the labor force. All of this is sort of how we're predicting and looking at how quickly are we going to get to where we need to be with respect to economic recovery. And like I said, what policy supports are going to be needed at the local, state, and federal level to help support that economic recovery. So in that regard, up until Saturday of this week, I would have said to you that in spite of the last stimulus that Congress passed, which would have then been in late December, much more needs to be done. But as you probably have seen, over the weekend, Congress did pass $1.9 trillion in stimulus. I have not checked the minute-to-minute news. I'm not sure that the president has signed it yet, but it is likely to happen in short order. And that federal stimulus that Congress just moved over the weekend has some pretty substantial benefits for individuals and employers in it. $1,400 stimulus checks, continuation of unemployment benefits, expanding of the child tax credit, and most importantly, from the chamber's perspective, there is state and local funding included in the $1.9 trillion. So in this state and local funding bucket, this is money that we've been long advocating for. Some of it would go to fight the pandemic, to help schools, local government, state government, vaccine distribution. I have not yet seen a chart of how much of that 1.9 trillion would make its way into Maryland. We'll get to this later in my presentation, but that money that comes to Maryland could go a very long way in supporting our unemployment insurance trust fund, which is dwindling to its final dollars. That's an exaggeration, but it's dwindling, and the responsibility for replenishing that fund is on the back of employers. So we'll get to that in just a second when I talk about our priorities. But that is all to say that Congress has acted. We expect to see that bill be signed in short order. And hopefully it goes a long way to support some of our policy objectives at the state level. I would still argue, and if you're a business owner, all of you are, you know this too, much more needs to be done to help our struggling businesses today, but also in anticipation of what's to come, of some of these layering costs that have been delayed that are eventually going to catch up to us. And we want to figure out how we can mitigate that. And so that's where we get to our state legislative session, of which I am proud to report we are halfway through, which makes me feel really happy because I have a countdown every day and I'm erasing and I'm seeing the number go down. My headache's getting less. I'm feeling great about it. So we are halfway through. So where are we? I know that I've spoken, I see some familiar faces. So some of this is going to be a little bit repetitive. Some of it will be updates. But we at the chamber, the state chamber, had developed in our legislative priorities this year. Typically, when we go into a session, we are always in the mode of defense. There are bad things happening that are going to be negatively impactful to businesses, and we have to prevent them from happening. Very rarely do we find areas where we are proactively supporting something that has a chance of passing. So always we're thinking about incentives for businesses, tax incentives, things that reduce regulation, things that cut the red tape. We're always thinking about those things and supporting those things. But unfortunately, those things don't rise to the top of the priority list for the Maryland General Assembly. This year, in a COVID year, we decided to take a different tact. And we said, look, what are the top 3 things that we could proactively support in support of businesses as we move through the session? So what I'm going to do in the rest of my presentation, and like I said, please chime in, ask questions, make this a discussion, because I could go forever if you don't cut me off, like runaway train. So cut me off at any time. And also, Christy, I would offer to you that I didn't have a PowerPoint, but I'm happy to share our bill tracker and some of this additional information with your audience so that they have it all in writing after the fact.
Okay.
So I'll break it out into 2 buckets. One, these proactive priorities that I've referenced. What are the top 3 things we are in support of that we're trying to move forward this session? And I'll give you updates on all 3 and where they are midway through. And then what are the big threats? And that's where we're probably going to spend more of our time, because there are many, many big threats to businesses that are still in play right now at this stage in the General Assembly session. So our top 3 priorities, and I know I'm seeing some familiar places, so again, apologies if this is repetitive. The first is liability protection for businesses. As you all know, businesses of all types and sizes, educational institutions, nonprofits, really organizations across the board have been, since day one of the pandemic, working diligently to protect your employees, your customers, the general public from exposure to the virus. But you've been doing this with incomplete and sometimes inconsistent information that's changing almost weekly. In fact, I just got an alert that the CDC now says it's safe to not wear a mask inside with your family or friends if you've both been vaccinated. That's new, changed today. So things like that are coming out from the CDC, from local and state officials all the time. And because of this incomplete and inconsistent information, juxtaposed to our businesses trying to protect their employees, themselves, and the public, there has been this growing risk of opportunistic lawsuits of the public, employees, customers, et cetera, bringing frivolous lawsuits against businesses in saying, I contracted COVID at your establishment and I'm going to sue you for X amount. And we've seen an uptick in those kinds of frivolous claims over time. And as a result, the chamber has been sort of the lead proponent on legislation that would provide liability protection from businesses. The bill number is Senate Bill 210. And essentially what it says is it doesn't eliminate lawsuits, like that's impossible. What it says is that if you are a business owner that follows all state and local and federal guidance, that it basically raises the threshold for which a claim can be brought against you. And so we're not precluding anyone from bringing a legitimate claim. We're not saying that an employee can't bring a workers' comp claim if they intend to prove that they contracted COVID at your business. We're trying to raise the threshold here so that these frivolous claims don't come to, as many of them don't come to fruition. Why do we do this? Especially for small business owners, the cost implications of these kinds of lawsuits are huge and extremely detrimental. Because even if it's very, very unlikely that many of these cases could be proven. But as a small business owner, if one's brought against you, you still have to retain counsel and pay for that counsel. You still have to retain counsel and pay them through the duration of the process. Maybe you'll get to a point where you settle and you have to pay out a claim for whatever reason. This is expensive. And so we're trying to eliminate that cost burden to the best of our ability. Senate Bill 210. It was heard in committee in early February. It is now part of a Senate subcommittee process. There were some challenges with it with respect to its retroactive nature. We were really trying to get it to apply dating back to the start of the emergency. And there is some case law that suggests that might not be constitutional in the state of Maryland. Instead, I think where the agreement will be is that it will be an emergency bill that would take effect immediately upon passage rather than be retroactive, and it would be prospective in that it would apply for 360 days beyond the end of the state of emergency. So trying to get us that protection from here forward, hopefully. That's kind of waning in subcommittee, and I hope to see some progress on it in the coming weeks, but that remains to be seen. So that's liability protection, priority number 1. Priority number 2, unless there are questions on that one. Proactive priority number 2 has to do with what we've already kind of touched on, and that's unemployment insurance. Our unemployment insurance trust fund has been dwindling because, as we all know, many claimants have been laid off and are entitled to those benefits, and those benefits have been paid out over the last year. And there was actually just quite a bit of press about the Department of Labor this morning and their inability to timely process claims. And I'm really glad I don't work at the department right now, because I would hate to be under that kind of stress and pressure. But as a result of all of that activity, the trust fund is dwindling. And so how do we replenish the trust fund? Who pays for the trust fund? Well, as you all know, it's employers in the form of premiums or taxes. How are those taxes calculated? The calculation is two factors. One has to do with a table of rates, which is determined by the Department of Labor in conjunction with the US Department of Labor. And the other has to do with the experience rating. And we have long said since the early days of the pandemic that we knew that those employers who had to lay off employees through no fault of their own, because they had to close their doors, because they had to comply with governor's orders, were going to have a negative impact to that experience rating. It counts negatively against your experience rating when you lay off an employee, and they draw off the fund. And so we've been saying since last May, look, that is unjust. These businesses are just complying with federal, state, local, or federal orders. It should not count negatively against them. Fortunately, the governor acknowledged and recognized this in an executive order that he issued in November of 2020, which says that the experience rating of an employer shall not be impacted in FY20 as a result of the pandemic, which is great. However, it didn't go far enough because we're still in a state of emergency, right? I mean, we needed to be more prospective than that. And so the good news is that there was a piece of legislative language that was added to the Governor's Relief Act, which passed and was enacted a couple of weeks ago, which says that the experience rating shall not be negatively impacted throughout the duration of the state of emergency. So whenever the state of emergency terminates that fiscal year, whatever we're in, hopefully, fingers crossed, FY21, could be FY22, your experience rating won't be negatively impacted. That takes care of part of the challenge of rising costs of unemployment insurance premiums for employers. It does not take care of the whole problem. And some of you probably already know this because maybe you're already receiving your 2021 UI tax notices. They started going out last week or the week before. And I've already started hearing from employers who are receiving those notices. And that is that because the trust fund is dwindling, we as a state have moved from table A to table F in terms of how rates are calculated. That means that on average per employee, you are going to see an increase of about $200. Best case, that's if you laid no one off. $200 per employee increase in 2021. I'm hearing from businesses that have seen increases of anywhere from 400 to 600% on their UI tax bills for 21. And we've been saying this for a long time. The result of moving from A to F is going to have a tremendous negative, detrimental impact on employers, some of whom are still not fully operational, some of whom are still not at their full revenue potential and don't know when they will be. So how can we ask them to pay 600% more in UI taxes right now? So we have a bill in Senate Bill 811. It was heard in committee last week, which attempts to address this. Essentially what it does is it asks the state to hold employers in Table C for this year, Table D in the following year, and Table E in the year after that to try to spread out that impact and try to lower that cost over time. We are not asking to be absolved, though we would like to be, of those taxes. We are asking to blunt the impact over time. So Senate Bill 811, which was heard in committee last week, attempts to do that. Not sure sort of how much traction it will get. It's being considered in subcommittee later this week, early next, and I'll keep you posted about its progress. The great news is, like I mentioned, Congress did pass a bill that has state and local funding in it. So we are already on the horn with the governor's office and the second floor, making sure, once again, that we let them know some of that money could be used in the unemployment insurance trust fund to offset these increases, and it must be done. Employers can't afford it. So sort of two paths here. If A doesn't work, then we got B. Obviously, getting it forgiven, by way of federal dollars is the gold standard. It's what we've all been wanting and asking for. If that doesn't happen, Senate Bill 811 is a backstop. So that's priority number 2. And then proactive priority number, does anyone have questions about UI, unemployment insurance? All right. And then the last sort of category of proactive things is something that we always pursue as a chamber, and that's this category of economic sustainability, economic relief. Any bills that provide capital or incentives, tax breaks, whatever it may be to help support businesses financially during this time. The number one bill within that category was the Governor's Relief Act, which we were happy to support throughout the process. It passed, like I said, 2 or 3 weeks ago, has already gone into effect. State dollars are already going out the door. That bill provides some sales tax relief for some small business owners. It addressed experience rating, and it does a number of other things. The governor's office has a really great sort of play-by-play on each of the programs in the Relief Act and how you can access them on their website. So if you haven't seen it yet and want more information, I'd encourage you to visit that. But that is an example of the types of bills that we're talking about when we're talking about economic sustainability. And there are a handful of others moving through the process, some that provide business property tax relief, some that provide tax relief for installing air purification. I don't anticipate that some of these smaller ones are going to make it through the process because of their budget implications, but we're still going to try to support them in the event that we're able to get some traction and get some whatever financial relief we can get, we'll take. I mean, it's really anything. The more, the merrier. Let's do it all, and we'll take what we can get and call it a victory. So that's the sort of 3 proactive chamber priorities for the session and where they are: liability, UI, economic relief. Any questions on those before I start hitting you with the doomsday? I like to end with that.
I have a couple.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Ben Burge. I'm with the Anne Arundel Economic Development Corporation.
Hi, Ben.
Hi. So how does the way the legislature's attacking the UI insurance, how does that dovetail with what the feds are doing?
On UI?
Yeah, because they tried to throw it into the relief package. I don't think it made it.
Yeah.
But
so
are they competitive? Do they overlap?
Yeah, no, they're not competitive. They sync up with one another. So the federal government provides funding for the extension of the unemployment benefits that are provided, right? And that's separate and apart from our UI trust fund that is paying out state benefits to claimants that are entitled to them. And so when I'm talking, the federal dollars flow in, but they're backstopped by sort of these stimulus packages. So when I say that the federal government is continuing their additional $300 unemployment benefits, that's backstopped by federal dollars. Right now, in our state dollars, that trust fund is dwindling, and employers are responsible for making sure it gets back up to its solvency threshold. And in the absence of this additional bucket of state and local funding, which we've been asking for months and months and months and months, that Congress just passed on Saturday, employers will be fully on the hook for bringing our trust fund back up to solvency.
Right.
Hopefully, the governor, and I have to be honest, I have been for the last couple of hours working back channels to try to figure out what restrictions are on that state and local. First, how much we're going to get, and I don't know a dollar figure yet. I know Pennsylvania said they're getting $19 billion. I don't know how they found that out, but I was like, tell me, you got a chart? Let me see what Maryland's making. But I want to know how much that we're getting, and then how much of that has restrictions on it, whereby Congress says X must go to here, X must go to there, X must go to there. Whatever there is, some has to go to our unemployment insurance trust fund. Otherwise, employers are going to be entirely on the hook for it, and we cannot afford it. We cannot afford it. It would more than offset what any employer gets by way of relief from the Relief Act. It would more than offset anything that employers are going to have to do when I tell you about some of these costly labor and employment mandates that are likely to come to fruition. Some component of that state and local funding has to make its way in our trust fund. But that was a long way around. They're separate but together. They run parallel.
And what about the liability issue? Federal versus state.
So there is a federal bill that was part of a previous stimulus negotiation. Back in December, there was a bill that provided businesses and organizations really of all types liability protection that Congress tried to pass. And unfortunately, it was largely driven by then Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. In negotiations back in November and December, it was taken out of the bill because it was a major sticky wicket and they couldn't get it through with liability in. And so that's why we turned to the state and we said, hey, Congress isn't doing this. They got a bill. It's not moving. It's not going anywhere. More than half the states have moved to address this in some form or fashion. I think we're at like 27 or 28 states have already addressed business liability protection. We need you, state legislature, to move this bill to get us some of those protections.
Okay,
and
so that was largely a response to Congress not doing.
Yes.
Okay. My last question is, and this is so there's a category, I'm using that word loosely. There's a group of bills that want to fund certain grants for businesses and for other things. And they always start with, well, when the state gets its unrestricted bag of money from the federal government, we want to take the first 50 million for this, the first 20 million for that, first 100 million. Do any of those bills have a chance?
I would say, so I think you're probably talking about, there's one that Senator Katie Fry Hester has in, it's a small business COVID relief grant program. Delegate Chi has some in that are similar. And then you're right, there are a handful of them that they ask if and when Congress appropriates X dollars, they shall be appropriated to these programs. I don't know that I could predict what chance they have. What I will tell you is it would be my prediction that the second that this money makes its way into the state, the governor, it's probably at the discretion of the governor right now, how those dollars get spent. Now, I don't know. For me, it's kind of a timing issue. I don't know how they can be, if the governor has the authority to dictate where the money coming from the federal government is appropriated via his budget process. I don't know how the state legislature at this time, before, as the money's coming in, is able to dictate exactly where it goes in that manner. So it's never been clear to me how the legality of that and how that would work. I think there is a genuine want to support businesses in that way. I think Senator Katie Fry Hester has, proven that she's dedicated to that. I just don't know how, there's so much competing for dollars going on right now. I just don't know how much of a chance, and I don't know that I could even predict it because I don't know how it would work and how the money would flow.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Any other questions on proactive priorities? Because we're getting to the dark cloud portion of my presentation where I tell you about all the threats. Yeah, so let's talk about some of those. When I talk about the things that we typically have to protect ourselves against as a business organization and a business community in Maryland, it typically falls into three buckets: tax, regulation, and labor and employment mandates. So let's touch on each of those quickly, and then we'll spend the bulk of our time talking about the really worst ones, which are new labor and employment mandates that are probably headed our way. So as it relates to tax, we typically in a session are facing all kinds of different tax threats. And a lot of these tax threats are more targeted at large businesses, big corporations, this idea that the legislature has created a narrative that these huge corporations are making money hand over fist and they are, hiding the marble under the cup and they deserve to pay their fair share and yada, yada, yada. Without much real acknowledgement that these large companies have secondary and tertiary economic impacts that trickle down to our medium and small businesses. And so any threat against them really has much broader economic impact. On the tax side, we typically see this in the form of bills like combined reporting or different new tax structures, the throwback rule, elimination of tax credits and incentives like the R&D tax credit, so on and so forth. I will tell you that on the big corporate tax issues, there seems to be an understanding that a time of economic uncertainty and a time when the economic implications of the pandemic have not yet been fully realized is not the time to be passing massive tax bills. That's the good news. I think we're from a tax perspective and a new tax perspective, I think we're in the yellow zone, almost to the green zone on not seeing any of those come to fruition. There are other tax bills that the chamber is not tracking that maybe you should be aware of. There's one that allows local governments more control in how they set their taxes. It's like called the Local Tax Relief for Working Families Act, which is just like the most ridiculous name for a bill that gives more control to county executives to raise taxes. There are things like that that are starting to move through the process, but the big bad tax bills, I think, are generally off for today. And call me in an hour. Someone will call me and be like, just kidding, it's moving. You have to get on the horn and call everyone you know. But for now, we're safe on the tax front. We are not safe on the regulation front, and we are not safe on the labor and employment mandate front. So I'm going to start with labor and employment because it's where it intersects with regulations. So on labor and employment mandates, there are 3 bills that I want to bring your attention to that I would classify as sort of the top 3 worst for business, top 3 things that you should be watching for, top 3 that may move. And I'll go in reverse order. The first is Senate Bill 211, the Time to Care Act. This is a bill that establishes a mandatory paid family and medical leave program whereby employers and employees would each contribute 50% contribution, and their dollar amounts contained within the bill, depending on your size and number of employees, where you would each contribute 50% to a fund whereby employees could then take, draw off the fund for paid family and medical leave. It's an employment mandate. It's got an exorbitant cost to employers. I will tell you that over time, the state chamber has kind of warmed up to this idea of there being a paid family leave mandate. And I'll tell you why. It's not it's not without lots of discussion, but many other states are moving in this direction. Many other states are putting this in place. And if we are not at the table and we're continually kicking and screaming and saying, no, 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 we're going to get a far worse program than if we try to adjust and help around the edges where we can. This program, the way it's set up in this bill in Senate Bill 211, it's really bad for a lot of reasons. And I want to again say, just for the record, we are not opposed to a program. We are opposed to this program as it's presently drafted. So this program, as it's written, establishes a new bank of leave. It's not just benefits for leave. It is a new bank of leave for those employers who don't presently have to provide leave under FMLA. So as you know, employers with less than 50 don't have to provide unpaid leave to those employees with less than 50 employees. So it establishes a new blank of leave. It expands the definition of family member and expands the definitions of how and when you can take leave. It, again, like I said, requires cost implications, requires employers to contribute. It allows an employee, technically as it's written, to take up to 24 weeks of paid leave that they could draw off this fund because they can take 12 weeks for themselves and 12 weeks for the care of a family member for any other reason. That's how it's presently written in the bill, 24 weeks of leave. And a lot of other really bad things. The big challenge for us right now is what we are saying, you can't pass this right now. We can't afford it right now. Another costly labor and employment mandate in a pandemic is short-sighted. It would more than offset any gains we've made in any of these economic relief programs. You can't pass it. But the General Assembly has formed a work group on Senate Bill 211, and they are trying to see where they can come to consensus and maybe move this bill out of Senate Finance. So I'd keep an eye on it. We are part of that work group process. We're trying to sort of carve around the edges where we can. Certainly 24 weeks is a non-starter. Definitions are a non-starter. If we can get them to a better place, that would be great. But again, the cost is the cost is the cost, and we can't afford it right now. We'll never support it, obviously. So that's number one, labor and employment mandate. Number two, labor and employment mandate is House Bill 1326. This is a bill that amends the Maryland Healthy Working Families Act, or our paid sick and safe leave law. And it does two things. One, it amends the base law, which we fought for how many years? It took 5 years to get paid sick and safe passed in Maryland. It basically relitigates that by removing certain exemptions for temporary and ag workers. And it also expands the definition of a family member for which you can take leave under the current law, which I'm not being facetious or smart aleck when I tell you this, but the way the language is written is that you could take leave to care for a family member or a person who is like family to you. And it literally says that in the bill, like anyone who's like their relationship is akin to being family with you. So my neighbor Joe down the street, who's lived there 50 years, who's my really great friend, who feels like family, I call him my family, I could take paid leave to care for him under the terms of this bill, which it's subjective, it's interpretive, it's really challenging to, figure out how you're going to address verification of that. That's not the worst part though. The worst part is that the bill adds a new section that says that during a declared public health emergency, employers shall provide 3 weeks, I think it's 14 days or 112 hours is how it's written in the bill, of additional paid leave during the state of an public health emergency for there's like 12 reasons, really broad reasons that you could take. It doesn't have any mention of having to prove that you contracted an illness or that you're quarantining because you got that illness at work. None of that. It doesn't allow an employer to require documentation, so it's ripe for abuse. Not to mention 3 weeks of paid leave. If you look at the fiscal note for that bill, the cost of that is astronomical. It's astronomical. And it provides no mechanism for employers to have really any say in how that leave will be used or taken. It puts the right all on the employee, which is really problematic for a lot of reasons that we could spend a lot of time talking about. I'd be really concerned about this one, and I'll tell you why, because the sort of juxtaposition here, and I want to also say I am in no way attempting to be disparaging of the labor unions. It's just that we often find ourselves on opposite sides of issues, and it's typically, I wouldn't say we're pit against one another, but what we want, they don't, and vice versa. The labor unions, in their advocacy this session, in seeking benefits for their workers, their essential workers in particular, are looking for leave benefits. That's really what they want. There's a much bigger bill that they're supporting, and I'll get to that in a second. But what they really want is leave. And so we're concerned that a standalone large leave bill will get some traction in the remaining days of session and start moving. We put out an action alert about it last week. Christy, feel free to share it with your audience if they want more information about the bill and what's going on with it. But it is dangerous in terms of how much it will cost and the operational implications of providing 3 weeks of new leaves. And I should also mention, that's regardless of your size. At least in Maryland Healthy Working Families, 15 or fewer employees are exempt. They have to just offer unpaid leave. In this, it's all in, everybody, regardless of size. 3 weeks paid leave. So that's a tricky one. The worst of the worst is House Bill 581. This is the Maryland Essential Worker Protection Act. And this bill is a massive labor and employment nightmare. And I'll sort of cruise through what all the provisions are. The challenging part of this bill is that as it's presently drafted, each of these provisions that I'm about to walk through for you would be triggered during a state of emergency. Right now, a state of emergency is so broadly defined that it could include a snowstorm. So the intent of the bill sponsors, we've learned, is that they want it to be like this situation, like a pandemic, a national emergency, a national pandemic. But as it's presently written, state of emergency is very broadly defined and could include things like a snowstorm, which would trigger all the rest of these provisions that I'm about to walk through with you. And then also the scope of the bill is it lists right now, as it's presently written, about, I think we have, I don't even remember the exact number of industry sectors. Essential worker and essential employer is so broadly defined that I have a hard time finding members who are not in it. It's like, we asked our intern, like, I don't even know what to do. It's like 6 pages of just lists of types of employers. I'm like, find me some members who aren't in this, because it's basically everybody, arborists, landscapers, you name it, everyone's essential under the terms of this bill. So in the instance that there is a declared state of emergency, all of these industry sectors that are outlined in the bill would be required to do the following things. First, they would be required to provide $3 an hour of hazard pay dating back to the start of the state of emergency for each of their essential workers. So $3 an hour hazard pay. They would be required to provide reimbursement for unreimbursed healthcare costs, like co-pays, like transportation to and from the doctor, super broadly defined. They would be required to provide 14 days of paid leave as for an illness broadly defined. Also 3 days of additional bereavement leave as part of the program. It also includes some brand new regulations as it relates to safe workplace, including allowing the employee the right to refuse dangerous work without any verification and based on the employee's own fear not defined. So the bill, the problem with this bill is it's exorbitantly expensive. Just the 3 provisions I've walked you through alone are exorbitantly expensive and would be catastrophic for employers. Hazard pay, healthcare costs, leave. Those 3 alone would devastating for employers. The other problem is that all of these other provisions are just littered with undefined terms. Like, what is mental distress? What is fear? How do you measure fear? How do you verify fear? All those different things. So this bill is massive. It's extremely controversial. It got about 700 pages worth of support and opposition testimony during the bill hearings. As you can imagine, sort of everyone coming out of the woodwork to voice their support or opposition to this bill. We are very, very, very much opposed to it. I serve on the legislative work group that is trying to figure out what to do with it. That work group is comprised of 4 senators, 4 delegates, 4 union representatives, and 4 business representatives. We've had 2 meetings and we've solved nothing. I'm exaggerating. We've solved one thing. The one consensus point is emergency is too broadly defined. We have to have new language to narrow the scope of what an emergency is. And so that will be refined. I will tell you, we are promised by leadership in the committee and in the House and Senate that some version of this bill is going to pass. So the onus is on us as a business community to work hard on figuring out what it's going to look like when it does. And your guess is as good as mine. At this point, it is so messy and so complicated and so cumbersome that I don't even know what our path forward would be. Hazard pay is a non-starter, obviously. Leave is a non-starter, obviously. Unless the leave is reimbursed by federal dollars, then maybe we can figure that out. Reimbursing healthcare costs is a non-starter. Anything with a financial component is a non-starter. Do I think we're going to have to concede on things like workplace safety planning, workplace safety regulations? Probably. And I think you should be on the lookout for the fact that OSHA is coming out in the next less than 10 days with some new emergency workplace safety regulations specific to COVID. And I think they'll give us a good sense of what new regs we can be expecting to come online from the OSHA perspective, but also translate down to whatever the state's going to do as well. So this one's bad. I wish I had more of a read on, like, an update on this is now what it looks like. But it's so messy and cumbersome that what we're trying to do is continue to make it as complicated as possible so it implodes upon itself. And then they say, oh, well, we didn't have enough time. Let's do it as a study. I don't think that's going to happen. And I think at some point we're going to have to come to the table with some constructive comments on what can be offered to support essential workers, however that becomes defined. But I would keep an eye on that one. And that one, Christy, for your membership, is one that we'll have multiple iterations of action alerts once we know sort of exactly what it's going to look like. We will circle the wagons and figure out what advocacy looks like. But until that time, it would be premature to be advocating on something that we don't exactly know what it's going to look like. But all I know is it will be costly, it'll be cumbersome, it'll be challenging. So keep an eye on that one. That's House Bill 581. And that's really all I have by way of updates. I'm happy to take questions. I do have to hop off at 3 for my legislative committee meeting, but I've thrown a lot at you. And like I said, I'm happy to give you our bill tracker with all of our information and links to our updates and our testimony and all the things that we're doing as a government affairs team at the chamber, and always offer ourselves as a resource to you all at any point if you have questions, comments, concerns, etc.
Just as a quick update to our members on the call, we have been sending the action alerts Ashley's described out to the membership, to the primary point of contact, I believe, on your account. I will make sure to continue sending those, and also I think The bill tracker is currently up to date on our website under the advocacy tab, but we'll make sure to send that along to everybody on this call following today's event. Are there any other questions from the group? Okay, last call.
Very informative, so thank you.
Of course.
Hey, Ashley,
Yes.
I got a question for you. It almost seems like some of these bills are touching or covering over intersecting, I guess is a good way to say it. So if all of them go through, they're going to be stacked one on top of the other on top of the other.
That's what
Like
we've
we're in the
been,
pandemic, and then they get the leave, and then you get leave because you have a sick family member, then you get this, and then you get that, and then you get this.
yeah, that's what, well, I mean, that's to your point, because all these leave bills are lingering out there and all of them seem to be still in play. That's a question we've been asking repeatedly during our work group sessions with Essential Worker Protection Act. Like, look, if you're going to put leave in this bill, then you need to make sure that you drop all those other leave bills, because how will that work? I gave the example during our last working group meeting, which I was brushed aside about, but I gave the example of bereavement leave. The House and Senate just passed a bill no less than a week ago that allows employees to use their paid sick and safe for bereavement. So you have to provide sick and safe leave. And now, as a result of this bill, as part of that, you have to allow them to use it for bereavement leave. Well, are we going to now add to that this additional 4 days of bereavement leave as spelled out in the Essential Worker Protection Act? And why shouldn't they use the bereavement leave they were just granted? So you're right. I mean, there's this like not thinking through in a holistic way how all of these different pieces fit together. And there are no grownups. I don't know where the grownups are who are overseeing, like where are the grownups who are supposed to be monitoring the playground and figuring out who's on first? Like that doesn't seem to be happening at the moment. And the House and Senate don't seem to be communicating about priorities, right? So on the Senate side, that leave bill I mentioned, the Maryland Healthy Working Families, doesn't have any support or traction. But there are other things over there that are moving. So how are all these things fitting together? And I think, unfortunately, like with most sessions, we're not going to know until after March 22nd, which is crossover date, which is anything that hasn't moved over to the opposite chamber dies, the bill dies. And so we won't know until crossover really what those leading horses are. And so probably we'll have to have another Central Maryland chamber reconvening after crossover when we really know, what's moving, what's not, what's still in play. But you're right. I mean, if all those things move, they are in conflict and they are compounding. And some of them, may run concurrently or may not. And we just, without knowing what's moving and how it all fits together, I can't make an educated guess on what that's going to look like. But it's scary to think about.
And then are people going to have to use like paid leave before they go into those things? Or is that not even a question mark?
So some of them, House Bill 1326, which is the Maryland Healthy Working Families, that is an expansion of leave benefits. So they don't have to use their existing 40 hours first. They just get to immediately start taking. Oh, and by the way, in that one, length of employment doesn't matter. You could have worked there for 1 day and be entitled to these benefits. Whereas in Maryland Healthy Working Families, you had to have worked for 106 days for an employer to be able to earn those 40 hours that you're entitled to. In this, no tenure required. But in that, for example, concurrently is not outlined. In Essential Worker Protection Act, there is a provision that requires you to use those 5 days first. Your paid sick and safe first or concurrently. So that provision exists there, but it doesn't exist in every one, and there's no consistency. And we've argued that all along. Like, you got to be consistent in what you're doing here, because conceptually we can argue about whether or not leave is required, isn't required, who should pay for it, how it should be taken. We can argue about that in concept. What we can't argue about is compliance. Like, if you pass this, employers have to be able to comply with it, and we have to understand with clarity what you mean. So I need you to write a provision that is clear on if this is new and stacked or if this is to be taken in concurrently. Some of them have it, some of them don't, but it's always something we're arguing about and for.
Okay, any last questions before we close? Okay, well, as Ashley said, we may need to have another session
Yeah.
in about a month to provide some additional updates. But thanks so much to all our guests for joining us today. And we are just so grateful for our partnership with the team at the Maryland Chamber of Commerce. And we look forward to working together even more in the coming year. If you're interested in getting involved in our Legislative Affairs Committee, we'd love to have you join us. Reach out to me following the event and we'll get you connected. And I hope you'll tune in for our future webinars and events. Tomorrow we have our next virtual networking mixer, and on Wednesday we're hosting a small business seminar on the Platinum Rule and increasing your sales. Our full event schedule can be found on our website at centralmarylandchamber.org. So as mentioned, we will share the materials mentioned today along with a link to the video of the session with you tomorrow. So thank you again to Ashley for a great presentation and to our Legislative Affairs Committee for all of their efforts. We hope to see you soon. Have a great day.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Ashley. Bye.